When federal immigration agents showed up at the Milwaukee County Courthouse in April,
Judge Dugan knew exactly what she was doing.
Judge Hannah Dugan ushered a criminal defendant
Get a date off the record right now.
out the back door.
The government is saying Judge Dugan wanted them to take this door
Down the stairs. This one or down the stairs?
A decision that landed her
Well, I think it's horrible.
in handcuffs
A public spectacle designed to humiliate a sitting judge.
and then in federal court.
Count 1 against Hannah Dugan, not guilty. Count 2, guilty.
3 weeks later,
I would just say the case is a long way from over.
the fallout is just beginning
Milwaukee County Judge Hannah Dugan today announced her plans to resign.
for a judge who is now benched. From the FOX6 studios, this is Open Record. I'm Bryan Polcyn, and I am joined here by FOX6 News anchor and reporter Carl Deffenbaugh, my co-host. Thank
Great
you
to
for
be
being
back
here.
with you. You guys are approaching a milestone, almost the 400th episode, I noticed.
Episode 395 this weekend. We welcome FOX6's Bill Miston back to the podcast. Bill, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
So, count 5 weeks from now, we'll be doing our 400th
go.
episode. We haven't really talked about what's going to happen with that yet.
Streamers,
But,
everything.
right, exactly. We'll have the confetti guns to fill this, and someone else can clean it up. We are recording this episode on Wednesday, January 7th, 2026. It is our first new episode of the new year. While we were on a holiday hiatus from producing new podcasts in December, one of the biggest legal stories in Milwaukee history took place in Wisconsin, on Wisconsin Avenue downtown inside the federal courthouse. It was the trial, of course, of Milwaukee County Judge Hannah Dugan. If you're not familiar with the case, don't worry. We will bring you up to speed. If you're a jury trial junkie, we'll have insight from the man who was in the courtroom for all 4 days of this unprecedented trial. We're going to also be joined by UWM Professor Emeritus Mordecai Lee to talk about the political fallout and much more. All of that starts right after this. And we are back here on Open Record. The Judge Hannah Dugan trial spanned 4 days the week before Christmas. But this case actually goes all the way back to April. And Carl, I'm going to start with you. For our viewers or listeners who don't know much about this trial, I think for us, we can't imagine anyone not knowing because we've lived it. But for those who don't know, get us up to speed. What happened? How did we get here?
Well, there are a lot of layers, a lot of complications to the build up to this as well. So yeah, good place to start. We go back to the early months of 2025. Of course, President Donald Trump returns to the White House, and there's changes in policies and a focus on immigration arrests happening all across the country. Specifically from Immigrations and Customs Enforcement agents, there was a change in the policy from the Obama administration to the first Trump administration, back to the Biden administration with the Democrat in the White House, and then once again to Trump's return to D.C. So there's a bit of the unknowns happening all around the country at this time, all leading up to the morning of April 18th, 2025 at the Milwaukee County Courthouse.
And just to be clear real quick, one of those, when you talk about those changes from administration to administration, one of those big significant changes was whether or not immigration enforcement could take place in places like a public courthouse.
Right. For much of the previous administration under President Joe Biden, there was a very high bar for arrests to happen in a public place like that, a courthouse, a place that was considered more of like a safe haven, along with churches and other institutions of the like. So we get to the morning of April 18th. This man, a 31-year-old Eduardo Flores Ruiz, who was an undocumented immigrant, had once arrived in the U.S., had been deported back home to Mexico, had returned more than a decade ago and lived in the area for years, is appearing in Milwaukee County Court in front of Judge Hannah Dugan for a battery case. He was facing 3 misdemeanors for a fight that had happened at the place where he lives. Well, federal agents get word, we believe through fingerprinting, that he was going to appear in the Milwaukee County Courthouse. And a team of agents from a number of different agencies show up at the Milwaukee County Courthouse on that morning, go and make their presence known in the courtroom of Judge Hannah Dugan to another staff member before the judge arrives. And then when she comes, as we saw so often in that surveillance video playing from the hallway of the Milwaukee County Courthouse, the 6th floor, Judge Dugan comes out of her courtroom eventually, addresses the different agents staged in the hall prepared to arrest Eduardo Flores Ruiz, and directs most of them, she thinks all of them it appears, to the Chief Judge Carl Ashley's office. And in that
one by
brief
one,
moment,
she goes down and points them, you got to go here.
Plainclothed agents all move into this hallway and adjacent offices of the Chief Judge, while in just a matter of minutes, it's amazing how quickly this all played out, Judge Dugan then goes into her courtroom and handles what was supposed to be the appearance of Eduardo Flores Ruiz Ruiz quite quickly, along with his public defender. And the key part for this entire trial and the charges that she's eventually found guilty of, the one count, has to do with this side hallway, not the main door into her courtroom, but a side hallway that had one door leading back to that 6th floor hallway and one to a staircase that could have potentially led down to the 5th floor.
So just to sort of boil it down to its simplest thing, the agents show up to arrest Eduardo Flores Ruiz. It appears Judge Dugan is not happy that they are there. She directs them to the chief judge, and meanwhile, prosecutors say, hurries up the case so she can get him out the door. She sends him out a back door. And Bill, you've been at the courthouse so many times. You've been in so many cases. For viewers, listeners who are following this podcast, why is that door significant? I mean, who do you see typically go in and out of jury doors or side doors? And do you often, when would you see a defendant go in or out of one of those doors?
Well, what was said during the trial and from our own experiences is really you would never generally see a defendant go out a door leading to a judge's chambers area or a public exit. Normally there are sally ports or doors that defendants, if they're in custody, are brought in through. This was not one of those doors necessarily, where this door led out into a hallway. It led into Judge Dugan's chambers as well as another neighboring judge's chambers. And as Carl said, it led also down a hallway that you could gain access back into the public hallway of the 6th floor or to a stairwell that went down to the 5th.
So the implication from the government here is that she was trying to sneak him out and get him away from immigration agents to help him avoid or evade arrest. And of course, the defense says, well, and here's the thing that made this case so fascinating and so complicated is the way she sent him. If he'd gone down the stairs, as you pointed out, there's this side door goes down the stairs, the ICE agents wouldn't have seen him. Now, who knows if they had somebody else stationed outside who might have seen him? They might have still arrested him. Who knows? What we know is he would have at least gotten out of the courthouse without being seen. In this case, he walks right back out into the public hallway, 11 or 12 feet away from the main entrance to Judge Dugan's courtroom. So the defense says, I mean, no harm, no foul here, right? I mean, he came out a door that was almost the same place.
And he was arrested after being followed out of the courthouse in a short foot chase outside.
And he was followed by agents on the floor, including one agent that rode the elevator down with Mr. Flores Ruiz and his defense attorney.
So the case all comes down to, if she was trying to help him get away, why did she send him down a place that comes out right back into the same hallway? And the government's argument is that's not where she wanted him to go. She wanted him to go down the stairs and try to get away. But he didn't get away. Does that matter? That was the crux of all of this. So as you're sitting in the courtroom for 4 days watching this and typing, like we'll talk about this more later. Bill was like a live stenographer, and he's not a professional stenographer, but he's trying to type this because there are no cameras allowed in federal court. There's no audio feeds allowed from federal court. So Bill had to be our eyes and ears in the courtroom and for all of you. And he was telling us exactly what was going on. But as you watch this play out, and we're trying to figure out, we didn't know. Maybe what does each side have here? What does the government have? What's the smoking gun? Was there for you a witness who stood out as like this was the star witness of the state's case?
If going back, if we could talk about the evidence that the government presented, I think what was one of the interesting or more interesting pieces of evidence was the digital audio recording of that courtroom of the events that happened that morning, where there were no cameras in the courtroom that day in Judge Dugan's courtroom, so we couldn't see what was happening, but we could hear, and it's open to interpretation at times what exactly was being said, but at times there was pretty clear audio of conversations between Judge Dugan and her deputy court clerk and her court reporter about the fact that there was an immigration enforcement arrest team outside in the hallway, that there was a conversation between Judge Dugan and her court reporter about the hallway and the stairs leading down to the 5th floor. So I think that was some of the more compelling evidence that was presented.
So really it was the audio that was the key.
I would think that the audio was a very big key to that. I think when we started getting into what witnesses spoke, obviously the government brought through a host of the agents that were there, not necessarily just immigration and customs enforcement, but FBI special agents that were tasked over to ICE enforcement removal operations as part of this renewed push by the Trump administration. And that was all to set the basics of what happened, right. to lay out, here's what happened, here's what the agents said happened, so that was locked in. And then you started to get into some of the other witnesses. And I think the biggest one was one of her fellow judges, the one that she shared that hallway with, the one that she shared next door was Cristela Cervera.
Yeah, Carl, we watched that together as we were doing all this live stream for so many hours. And I remember when she testified that day, we kind of had, and we talked to Ted Perry, who was at the courthouse reporting back, that felt like the most important human witness.
I would agree. And just one other point on the audio before we move on to Judge Cervera there is the fact that we did not hear Judge Dugan in her own words. She did not take the stand to testify in her defense.
Constitutional right.
Her constitutional right, often the case for a defendant. But as a result, the only time we heard Judge Dugan, Bill, was in those audio recordings and a few key lines that the government kept harping back on, the take the stairs or the I'll take the heat.
I'll get the heat.
Excuse me, I'll get the heat.
heat.
That we heard a couple times, opening statements, closing arguments, all of that from the government to kind of hit at the intent and that question of, okay, maybe she was not we can get into the discussion of the policy. Maybe she was not okay with the possibility of arrests happening at the courthouse, but it was actually what she did, her actions on that day, that ultimately led the jury to that guilty verdict on the felony charge.
Now, we always start running away with time here on the podcast, and I know we want to get to our next guest, so I want to get to just kind of concluding some things here, but I'm going to mention real quickly, the reason Judge Cervera was such an important witness is she actually, a fellow judge came out and said she felt uncomfortable. She felt like Judge Dugan used her to sort of as a show of force against these ICE agents, and it's by having her keep her robe on.
I think it's important to set the context for those who are listening or watching is that when Judge Dugan, before she had gone out into the hallway, she had gone over to Judge Cervera's courtroom and motioned to her, and she testified giving a come here motion with her finger. Yeah. Judge Cervera thought she was in trouble at first. She goes into her chambers, says she begins to take off her judicial robe, and Judge Dugan, Cervera tells her to leave it on. And then they walk down that hallway and then start speaking to some of the agents that were in that hallway. Judge Cervera said that she wasn't exactly sure what was going on in the moment, but then that she ultimately accompanied those agents just down the hall to Chief Judge Carl Ashley's office before and waited there with them as they made a call to Chief Judge Carl Ashley, and then Judge Dugan returned to her chambers. And then when Judge Cervera was finished and began walking back, she didn't have her key card. She was walking in a public hallway with her robe, which judges testified that isn't normally done at all. And she felt embarrassed. She had to go in through Judge Dugan's courtroom, past the bar, through the court, and into that restricted hallway to gain access back to her own courtroom.
Let me ask you this, Bill, as well, because I think it's important, again, to kind of set the scene for people maybe playing catch-up, and we'll get into some of the national political implications with our next guest. But we heard throughout that week of coverage from our legal experts how unprecedented this trial was, to have a sitting judge as a defendant, to have fellow judges on the witness stand, to have the chief judge on the witness stand, all in this federal courthouse in downtown Milwaukee. What did it feel like in the room for you to have all of these big name players in at least the local legal system on opposite sides of a major trial like this?
I don't know if I could say how it felt, but I definitely did see some of the through lines when you had all of these individuals that are part of the legal community, longstanding members or even politicians. You have the judge presiding over the case, a former politician, a former colleague of the next guest that is coming up here, right? Judge Lynn Edelman, who is the district judge for the Eastern District of Wisconsin, has one of the witnesses for Judge Dugan, former Milwaukee Mayor Tom Barrett, who began his legal career in that very same courtroom judging for clerking for Judge Warren. You had members of the defense team, some of which are former U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District, Steve Biskupik, who has connections with the prosecution, the government, Kelly Brown Watzka, Keith Alexander.
He appointed a number of the people he was basically going against.
And Richard Froling. So there's those connections. And then
This was a star-studded trial.
To me, it was very interesting to see just those intersections of the legal and politics of there's all these connections and no doubt probably still very friendly. And I think that was where when in talking with attorneys in the days that followed after Judge Dugan had a split verdict, a jury found her guilty on a split verdict, that there was a palpable unease at the Milwaukee County Courthouse because of what everyone had kind of been through and what that whole community had been through.
Well, and I know we got to get to break because we want to bring our guest on, but I want to point out as we talk about all this, that is, as you mentioned, where this landed. A split verdict. It was a 6-hour deliberation, roughly, maybe a little more than 6 hours, and the jury came back finding Judge Dugan guilty of a felony and not guilty of a misdemeanor.
Guilty of a felony of obstructing a federal proceeding, meaning of obstructing a federal immigration proceeding.
Right. And not guilty of the misdemeanor.
Yeah, concealing an individual to prevent arrest.
Such similar elements in each of those, and it's one of the reasons the defense is challenging that verdict and asking Judge Adelman not to accept it and enter it as the official judgment of the case. We'll talk more about that. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to bring in UWM Professor Emeritus Mordecai Lee to talk about some of the political fallout from all of this right after this.
We are back here on Open Record with our next guest, a familiar face if you were watching our coverage all week long of the Judge Hannah Dugan trial. That would be UWM Professor Emeritus Mordecai Lee. Made himself right at home here at the Fox 6 studios. Good to have you back. You're not sick of us.
Thanks for inviting me.
We haven't yet created your own bedroom or office here, but it's in discussions.
You were such a great person to have throughout our coverage because the reason that this trial received the attention it did, certainly from our station locally, but from a national standpoint as well, is because of what we touched on at the beginning, the political implications and the changes to immigration policy under the second Trump term now, and what this case became in terms of a referendum, kind of a flashpoint around this larger push against immigration arrests happening around the country. At the time of Judge Dugan's arrest, very notable that there was a picture of her posted by the FBI director of her leaving the Milwaukee County Courthouse in handcuffs, something folks on the other side said was not necessary, was not normal, but clearly an example was being made of her from the administration early in this year of 2025. What did you make of this trial in terms of how we got here, what it said about the larger issues in this country?
I think the reason the case was so interesting is because it was a clash between, in a sense, two different worlds. And I don't mean Republicans and Democrats. I mean between the world of politics and the world of public administration. You know, politics is about values, what you believe in, what laws you try to defeat or pass. Public administration is about the implementation, the law enforcement of whatever laws are on the books and whatever formal policies the heads of departments have enunciated. So in terms of the politics of it, clearly all the viewers, or 99% of the viewers, had an opinion. This was a good arrest. This was a bad arrest. This was a politicized arrest. This was an unfair arrest. That was the sort of the easy part. What it came down to is the discretion of law enforcement. And I was really glad, Carl, in your introduction, where you said that the policies by the administration changed between President Biden and changed between President Trump. President Biden said, in terms of going into a church, a courthouse, try not to do that. In terms of President Trump's enunciated in foreign policy, it was go get them. And so here we were in a situation where the law was relatively clear in terms of how these agents were acting, that they felt that being in a courthouse was a safe place because nobody could walk in there with arms, being with a weapon, except for law enforcement, and that they were able to pull together a group of agents because that it was less dangerous when you can swarm an individual as opposed to one person trying to arrest somebody who doesn't want to get arrested. Even you mentioned the guy in the elevator, the ICE agent who followed them in the elevator, standing right next to him, did not engage in the arrest because he felt it would be too dangerous for the defendant and for the ICE agent. So we've got this public administration quandary about, is this a good policy or a bad policy? And I think the way it's played out politically is that it's had a kind of a narrow impact. In other words, was it okay that the ICE agents were in a courtroom, were in a courthouse, were in the public part of the courthouse, the corridor. They didn't go into the judge's chambers or the courtroom to try to do the arrest there. And was this, in a sense, okay? And because I think of the precision of the charges and the precision of the verdict, we're really dealing with an issue of public administration as opposed to this sort of fantastic, fabulous, wild and crazy political and partisan issue.
But, I have to ask, Mordecai, because it feels like, I don't know if any of you guys are Grisham fans, John Grisham. It felt like a Grisham novel in a way, because we see federal and local duels over policy and things all in policies and politics all the time. This was federal and local clash that involved an arrest of a public official, and that really took this to the next level. I mean, you've got robes, and it felt dramatic, and it was a real thing playing out right in front of our eyes.
To a certain extent, if we strip down the case, I think there's little confusion that she was trying to prevent the arrest. And there was little confusion about the arrest. And finally, that the principle that every American can say sort of in their sleep is that no person is above the law. And so the question was, even a judge, a circuit judge, a state law judge, was not above federal law. There's just no doubt about that. And I don't think that can even be appealed. She did not have any kind of immunity. She did not have any kind of special privilege. And so that's how, as they stripped down the case, that's what it came down to. Did she engage in a violation of a federal law?
And that seemed to be the crux of the split verdict from the jury, too. The very technicality about whether she had to know, maybe Bill can explain this a little bit better in the next segment, whether she had to know those agents were specifically there for Eduardo Flores Ruiz or just there to make an arrest. And that seemed to be where the breakdown came, where she's guilty of the felony, the more general charge, and not guilty of the misdemeanor, which actually was the more pointed charge, despite being the lesser.
Right. And I think this is really came down, as you said, to the technicality. She's sitting in her courtroom, and one of her court reporters rushes in and says, there are ICE agents out there. So she immediately understands that she probably has somebody in her courtroom who is probably an illegal and probably would be arrested. I don't remember the specifics if she knew the name of the person, but so she charges out into the hallway, perhaps not knowing the name of the person, and tries to get them away. But by the time she goes back into her courtroom, she knows who it is because her lawyer came forward and identified herself as handling the case. She calls the case right away. When the case is called, they have to say the name of the person who's being charged. So at that moment, she definitely knew who the individual was. And so when she said those famous lines, I'll get the heat, or take the staircase, or they're whispering with each other, should I show him, where it is? I think that's why it was so easy for them to say she definitely knew who it was.
As I think about what was going on in those conversations, I think we know now she's been obviously convicted of the felony. There was always the question of why send him out the back door. Whatever the stairs implicated, why send him out the back door? And she actually gave a statement to police that was not admitted at trial because it was determined to be a self-serving statement and it was not admitted as evidence. But she said something to the effect of there was a migrant in her courtroom and she did send him out that back door, but she does that from time to time when the situation warrants. What was it about that situation that warranted it? And I think that was really the question for the jury. It seemed to be the situation was ICE agents were outside and she didn't want him to get arrested. Ultimately, we know there's this split verdict. And I think the moment the verdict came down, one of the questions we all had right away was, okay, what does this mean? Because Who won? Well, not just that. When she was first arrested, she was immediately placed on paid leave. She was not hearing cases this whole time. So she hasn't been acting as a judge. She still is a judge, and then this happens, and it's a felony conviction. And the question was, does that mean she's automatically no longer a judge? Does the Supreme Court have to take action? what happens next. And we heard the state legislature, the Republican-controlled legislature, come out and say, if she doesn't step down, we're going to take action to impeach her. Ultimately, we just heard now here, right after the first of the year, that Judge Dugan submitted her resignation letter to Governor Evers. And in that letter, she said essentially, I don't want to be a distraction. Those aren't the exact words. That's a paraphrase. I think it's pretty accurate, that the citizens don't deserve that. So she's going to step down. There's been some reporting since then. Bill, who's sitting here and watching me as I say this, did some reporting this week that there's an additional bonus or benefit to her in having resigned rather than being impeached. And that is that she likely will keep her state pension. Any thoughts on that and a reaction to that? Is that a motivation here? Was that an important decision for her to make to preserve a pension?
Yeah, I think Bill really drilled down into it, that yes, the Department of Employee Trust Funds, the state agency that does pensions, including my pension, is the ones who would handle it. And they gave him a general policy, a general response that generally speaking, what happens in a court case does not affect a person being eligible for their pension because they earned it during all those years. But what I think the department didn't want to say was, if she will be convicted of a felony once Judge Edelman enters the guilt verdict, and we probably should talk a little bit about that, but if she's found guilty of a federal felony, or if she had been impeached by the state legislature, that would have been a very different situation. And I think it may well have led to her not being eligible for her pension. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of arguments about it. There are very few, there's no precedent for it. But I think what she did right after the new year is she wanted to be conservative about protecting her pension. And by resigning voluntarily, then she has nothing on her record as a state employee. After all, judges are state employees. She has nothing on her record untoward on her record. And so therefore there can be absolutely no arguments about if she qualifies for a pension. Now, play it out one more time. Let's say Judge Edelman gives a directed verdict that he overturns the felony conviction. Now she has no felony conviction, but she's out of office. She can't ask for her office back because the governor's already said, I've received your resignation, I accept your resignation, and I'm about to appoint somebody to fill your office. Presumably, she would appeal, she would ask the governor to consider reappointing her the next time there was a vacancy, but she can't turn back the clock.
Interesting.
I want to, you mentioned something I want to get to before we go, and we've got to bring Bill back for our third segment here, but I want to ask you this because you mentioned the fact that the jury did come back with this verdict, but the judge still has to enter or accept that verdict before. I mean, she's been convicted by a jury, but she doesn't have this felony conviction on her record yet because the defense has asked for motion hearings. They want to argue that they believe the jury's verdict is defective. What does that mean? What do we still have to look forward to here? Because we've got a few months, I guess, of waiting before we even hear what each side has to say about that.
Well, it's very significant that Judge Edelman, as soon as he heard the request that he overturn the verdict, did not schedule a sentencing date. Usually what happens is a judge will sort of roll it all together, and 99 times out of 100, they'll reject the request that they overturn the verdict, and they'll proceed with the sentencing. In his case, he froze any potential consideration of sentencing and set up a 3-month briefing schedule for him to hear the arguments whether he should overturn the verdict or specifically not enter the verdict of being guilty of a felony. And I think this is a hint from the judge that he's taking it very seriously. He does not believe it's a kind of a motion going through the motions, but that he's open-minded enough to consider it as opposed to reject it offhand. And during the hours that all three of us were on the air, I mentioned that I knew Lynn because we were both state senators, and that Lynn Edelman was a civil libertarian and very zealous in protecting the rights of defendants, even at the cost of the rights of victims. And so I think that it's fair enough to say that Judge Edelman might be sympathetic to this. I'm not sure he'd go all the way to reject it.
I wonder, too, if it's also a move by Judge Edelman to protect the integrity of the trial, because the other possible outlet for Dugan's defense team is an appeal that we are somewhat expecting to the Seventh Circuit Court in Chicago on this verdict. And I wonder if from Judge Edelman's perspective, it's okay, give me your best argument. Give me all the chances that you are legally entitled to make the case that I should overturn this. And then I can say one way or the other that I gave you your opportunity. There was no, steps missed in this process, at least in terms of the federal court here in Wisconsin with this trial and with the ultimate.
Right. When we as sort of lay people think about appealing something to a higher court, we think you can appeal anything. No, you can't appeal anything. You can't just say, well, I thought they were wrong or I didn't like the verdict. There has to be a material error on the part of the judge. He accepted evidence that should not have been accepted, or he rejected evidence that should have been accepted. And in your example, Carl, based on the specifics of the argument about overturning the verdict, did the judge not consider X, whatever the X
It seems
was?
to me that it would be the jury instructions that were really controversial during deliberations. There were a couple that the judge said the parties couldn't agree on, and he made a determination. And those seemed to influence the ultimate verdict. I could see those being things that the defense would say, we think the judge made a mistake in that decision.
And I think it's a long shot that he's going to overturn the verdict. And that's why, you're right, Bryan, that's probably going to be the specifics of it. And I think he was very careful when he got the two requests with the jury. What were they asking him and what was he going to respond? That he wanted to be as narrow as possible in his answers so that nobody could claim that he was just sort of inventing law or inventing jury instructions.
I want to ask you one last question before we go, because we got to get to our, back to Bill to finish this thing out. But I wanted to ask you this because we're talking politics, and there is this overarching still political sense from all of this, and there will be political fallout going forward. We have a governor's race in Wisconsin where both parties have a primary. That is unusual. It hasn't been, it's been a while since that's happened. And there are, of course, future Supreme Court races. What kind of impact do you think this case will have?
Next year.
I mean, so there's a lot coming up. Will this have an impact? Will this even be an issue? Will this come up? Or is this kind of really a non-issue in those races?
Well, there are two candidates in the Republican primary, and I think we can presume that they'll support President Trump's policy that it's okay to go into a courthouse. So that's probably not going to be unpredictable in their respect. But there's a baker's dozen worth of candidates on the Democratic side. And you've got people from the far left to sort of the moderate middle. And whoever wins the primary will be signaling how they feel about the Dugan decision, how they feel about President Trump. And if they want to make their election a referendum on President Trump or a referendum on ICE's policies about arresting illegals. And if it's a more far to the left nominee who wins, I think we'll see that brought openly. If it's somebody more from the moderate, I think they'll probably walk away from it.
All right. We do have to say goodbye for now to, I say for now, because we know we'll have you back, to Professor Emeritus Mordecai Lee.
We're not done with you, Mordecai.
We're by far not done. We will have Bill Miston back with us. One of the things we're going to talk about when we come back is how we pulled off, as Fox 6 News, what I think is one of the most complicated and extraordinary plans to cover a federal trial, a high-profile trial with no video and no audio. We'll talk about that when we come right back. We are back on Open Record. We have Bill Miston back with us here, the master of Microsoft OneNote, our go-to lead chair when it comes to covering jury trials. And this was one of the most unusual trials I've ever been a part of covering. Now, federal court never does allow cameras, never allows audio. So this wasn't unusual for this case, but we don't often cover federal trials for that reason because they're really logistically difficult to cover for television news. In this case, we knew this was such a huge case. We had to cover it. And we really, Fox 6 News, I think, knocked it out of the park with the plan we had. We had so many people involved. And I don't think I'm speaking out of turn to say the other stations in town were looking at us going, where are all these people coming from? How have you dedicated all these resources? We had people who were in the media room, people who were in the courtroom. We had people who were in another room observing a feed that was coming out of the courtroom. We had people outside the courthouse. We had Jason Calvi at the Milwaukee County Courthouse where all of this took place, the crime itself that was in question. And of course, we had all of us here at the studio. But Bill was the one in the courtroom. And Bill, I mentioned you're like the master of Microsoft OneNote. You're also like, you're just a trial savant. You've even kept statistics on this trial that tell us a little bit more about what happened here. Tell me what you were just telling me before we came back on.
Well, in order to try and keep track of things, it involves spreadsheets, it involves notes, note-taking. And so in order to try state trials, it's a little easier. You have video that you can go back to. You have other people that can more easily come in and go from state court. Federal court is completely different. But just looking at broad view of throughout the entire trial, there were 19 government witnesses. There were 4 defense witnesses. So there were more than 16 hours of witness testimony that spanned over 4 days. This doesn't include the entire day of jury selection that went into this before the week of the trial started, and deliberations that lasted a little more than 6 hours, and the jury having 2 questions, I think 2, maybe 3 in there. So lots of work that went in to try and keep track of some of this, in order to relay it back to those that were in the courthouse and working on their reporting, as well as everyone that was back here.
I want to point out that you're talking about all those witnesses and 16 hours of testimony. The reason that's so remarkable is you were essentially live typing all of this that was happening, not just the quotes or as close as you could get to them as it's happening, but also trying to give us an idea of the context behind the things that were being said. Observations you're making in the courtroom. We can't see people's facial reactions. We can't see that, this really prominent attorney just stepped into the courtroom to watch. So you're essentially being live stenographer and a reporter at the same time. And you know that if you miss a really key quote, that we can't go back and check the video. There's no other feed. It's on you. How did you do that? Honestly, how did you do it?
It was you try to do this every day. You want to be as close to correct as possible, right? Whenever we're doing our reporting, you want to be correct. You want to be right. And whether it comes down to sitting there and listening, paraphrasing, trying to understand the direction that maybe the government or the defense is going. I'm not a lawyer, but trying to maybe take a step back and go, okay, I see what they're trying to get at. Maybe I'm not sitting there and typing out all these questions because there's lots of clauses and lots of pauses and citing that's going on. So it's not germane necessarily to what we're trying to keep track of, but really trying to be the eyes and ears, as well as one of our other counterparts, Anthony Mandello, who's on the web team. He was in the media workroom where there was a live audio feed and video feed.
So he was doing the live blog you could see on our website.
He was doing
right?
So. Yeah. There was kind of a check there in case that if something was. If I missed something as I was trying to go back and provide some context or find publicly sourced example of an exhibit that was being presented in court, say ICE enforcement policy or a training that judges had taken part in when it comes to ICE enforcement actions in courthouses. So trying to provide all of that context in real time, in line with what is being said and what is happening in court.
It was, the level of detail was amazing throughout. We had some fun with one of the moments. I think one of the days there was even a detail about it appears Jimmy John's is going to the jury room during the lunch break. I mean, you didn't miss a beat.
When we were Carl and I were on the live desk together doing this, and it was so funny because we don't have a video feed to watch, so we're watching our computer that would be updating in OneNote. But what was really funny is we were getting your updates before Ted would, and Ted was at the courthouse in a different room. So we would see something, go, my gosh, this just happened, and Ted would go, okay, oh yeah, I'm seeing that too.
I guess we had a better internet connection.
It was fascinating, and I'm just saying, we can't show you what this all looked like, but the plan that went into organizing the personnel to cover this, 3 different rooms of the courthouse, and then all of the other people in place. It was really, I think, a monumental exercise. And I don't know about you guys, I think we knocked it out of the park.
We joke, too, that if Bill gets carpal tunnel, it's definitely a workman's comp situation for all that typing.
Yeah, the carpals were tunneling after after that. But, I think it was everyone had their role and everyone knew what they had to do. We pivoted or changed direction. I know that there was some thoughts of, oh, well, Bill, when you're done for the day, you're going to, maybe put something more together at the end. And just based on the logistics of how things worked, it just wasn't possible.
Those were long days, I'm guessing, then, because just the getting there early enough to get in place, then the whole day of the trial, then all the after stuff you had to do, that had to be a long week.
Let me ask you about the fallout from the trial as well. And as we touched on with Mordecai, this is not over yet. There are still motions. There's a possibility of an appeal, and we're still waiting on that conviction, that judgment of conviction from Judge Edelman in this case. So there's still a lot that we will cover related to this. But in general, it started with such a moment. We use the word flashpoint throughout that week of coverage related to the larger immigration debate in the country back in the spring. By the time we got around to the actual trial, I asked a similar question to Jason Calvi, our political reporter, who I think rightly pointed out the weekend before this trial happened to be a horrible weekend around the world. There was the shooting in Australia at Hanukkah festivities. There was the shooting at Brown University before that. I'm curious, the week of the trial, once we finally got to it, what it felt like from a national perspective. Were there media members from DC there, from the affiliates monitoring this trial? Because it ended up, we saw the headlines when she was convicted from a lot of those outlets, but I'm curious what it was like the week of and what you think the impact of the trial will be going forward into this big year of 2026.
I know that leading up to this, when the arrest first happened, there was a lot more national attention to this. When the trial began, I believe that there was some television network presence and likely a few national print reporters, but not nearly the amount of reporters that had come to town back in April or May.
I think that's just the nature of the federal court being so closed off because of cameras.
Because I thought about it related to the Kyle Rittenhouse trial, which we were able to watch the video, and of course the riots in Kenosha from that night too certainly capture a national presence in that way. But it felt different once we actually got to the trial.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that there was as much. I mean, it was definitely a national story, and it still is a national story. But I don't think that there was the level of involvement of print outlets or broadcast outlets that were there for the trial compared to when the arrest happened.
Like the old days when you'd see satellite trucks lined up on the road. It wasn't anything like that.
Right.
Yeah. All right. We have to wrap this up because we are going to go off the record, and we're going to do that when we come right back. It is time for us to go off the record. The part of the podcast where we get a little more casual and have a little fun by answering a question. This time I have prepared, and the question is, it is our first podcast of the new year.
Ooh.
Do you have a New Year's resolution, or do you think resolutions are dumb?
I should have guessed that this would be the one. I don't know about you. I've never made a resolution. There's things I want to focus on in the new year. There's things, goals that you set for yourself potentially in the year ahead. I think it's the nature of flipping the calendar. But I've never been someone to say, okay, I'm going to eat better. I'm going to make it to the gym 3 times a week or anything like that. So maybe I'm the wrong person to ask here.
Do you have, or have you ever made a New Year's resolution?
No.
Have you ever never even made one? I was going to ask if you kept one.
You're no resolution.
Do you have time for that? It's like you're just gonna do it, right? You're either gonna do it or you're not gonna do it. So I don't think that just because you turn a page on a Gregorian calendar that it's all of a sudden you're gonna be a whole new person.
How about you, Brian?
I've never really sat down and gone, okay, in the new year I resolve to X. But sometimes you go, you know what? There's a sense of renewal. Maybe this year I'm going to try to do something a little better. And one of those things is I'm going to show up to the digital studio before 9:30 instead of waltzing in at 9:32.
I will say I was surprised I was actually the last one here today, not the first one.
Did you show up at 9:30?
No, because we were sitting back there talking to Mordecai, and then when I looked at my watch and it was 9:31, I was like, all right, we should probably get out there.
Okay, all right.
So today I was on time.
Now this is the easy time when everyone shows up to the gym. So by February, we better still see you at 9:29.
That's why my next question was going to be, have you ever kept a resolution? But since you guys don't have them, you've never. I will tell you, my stepson is an avid weightlifter. He goes to the gym all the time. He's a big guy, so he's there all year round, 5 days a week. He's there, and so he's irritated.
Oh, he probably hates
because
January,
the gym is packed, and he's like. He actually said this. He goes, I only have to put up with this for a couple more weeks because he knows people will immediately start dropping back off. Anyway, we hope your resolution is to make sure you listen or watch every episode of Open Record. And we'll wrap things up here for this episode right after this. And that is all the time we have here on Open Record. If you have a topic you'd like us to discuss on the podcast or an issue you think we should investigate for Fox 6 News, send us an email to fox6investigators@fox.com. Thanks to my co-hosts, Carl.
Always a pleasure.
Bill Miston.
Thank you.
Also, thank you to the other people who make this podcast possible, including our executive producer, Sarah Smith, our editor, Dave Machuda, our graphic designer, Craig Sween, and of course, what is Cale's title these days? I always forget his title. It's something extraordinaire. What do you know what it is, Dave? I can't remember. It used to be chief photographer. It's something better than that now, but I've already forgotten. With that, I'm Bryan Polcyn. We'll see you next week.